The morning of September 15, 1942, found the aircraft carrier USS Wasp operating southeast of Guadalcanal. Her flight deck was busy with preparations for another strike against Japanese positions. Commander Yahachi Tanabe, peering through the periscope of the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-19, watched the American task force through the thin magnification of his optics. He had been stalking these ships for hours, maneuvering his boat into position while avoiding the destroyer screen that circled the carriers like protective wolves. At 13:20 hours, Tanabe gave the order. 6 Type 95 torpedoes left I-19's tubes, their oxygen-fueled engines leaving almost no wake as they ran hot, straight, and normal toward the American ships. 3 of them struck Wasp on her starboard side. The detonations tore open her hull, ruptured aviation fuel lines, and ignited fires that would ultimately consume the ship. By evening, Wasp was gone, taking 173 men with her to the bottom. For Tanabe and his crew, the sinking represented vindication. Japanese submarine doctrine, carefully developed over 2 decades, emphasized attacks on high-value warships, aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers. These were the targets that mattered, the ships that could decide the outcome of decisive fleet actions. Tanabe had done exactly what his training demanded, and he had succeeded brilliantly. I-19 returned to Japan to a hero's welcome, with speeches and ceremonies celebrating this achievement. But there was something that neither Tanabe nor the admirals celebrating his success understood that morning. Something that would only become clear as the months turned to years and the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. The sinking of USS Wasp, impressive as it seemed, represented a fundamental strategic failure. Not a failure of execution or courage or seamanship, but a failure of imagination, of understanding what actually wins wars fought across thousands of miles of ocean. The question this story answers is not whether Japanese submarines could sink American warships. They proved they could. The question is why, despite these tactical victories, despite sinking fleet carriers and cruisers and destroyers, Japanese submarines ultimately contributed almost nothing to Japan's war effort, while American submarines strangled the Japanese empire into submission. The answer lies not in technology or training or individual courage, but in a more fundamental difference. A difference in what each navy believed submarines were for. To understand what happened, you must first understand what the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about submarines and their role in modern warfare. This belief system did not emerge from nowhere. It was built carefully, deliberately over 20 years of study and debate that began in the aftermath of the First World War. Japanese naval planners in the 1920s faced a problem. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had locked Japan into a 5-to-3 ratio with the United States in capital ships. For every 5 battleships America built, Japan could build 3. For every 5 aircraft carriers America possessed, Japan could have 3. This was, the Japanese understood, an unacceptable strategic position. In any direct confrontation between the fleets, American numerical superiority would prove decisive. The solution, Japanese strategists decided, lay in what they called interceptive operations. They would not seek to match American numbers. Instead, they would whittle down the American fleet before the decisive battle ever occurred. Submarines would patrol the approaches to the Philippines and the Marshall Islands. They would shadow the American fleet as it advanced across the Pacific. And when opportunities arose, they would strike, attacking carriers, battleships, and cruisers with torpedoes that were, by the late 1930s, the most advanced in the world. This doctrine was not theoretical speculation. It was refined through extensive war games and fleet exercises. It was codified in training manuals and operational plans. Every submarine officer learned it. Every crew practiced it. The submarine force was organized specifically to support this mission, with long-range boats capable of operating thousands of miles from home bases. Equipped with massive Type 95 torpedoes carrying 991-pound warheads, the largest of any nation's submarine torpedoes. The Japanese also built the largest submarines in the world. The I-400 class displaced 6,500 tons submerged and could carry 3 aircraft in a watertight hangar. The I-16 class carried midget submarines piggyback for special operations. 52 of the world's 56 submarines larger than 3,000 tons were Japanese. These were not vessels designed for commerce raiding or convoy interdiction. They were designed as fleet scouts and warship hunters. By December 1941, when war came, the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine force, numbered 63 large submarines, with more under construction. Their crews were well trained, experienced in peacetime operations throughout the Pacific. Their torpedoes were reliable, unlike the American Mark 14, which would plague US submarines for the first 2 years of war. Their doctrine was clear and well understood. They knew what they were supposed to do, and in the opening months of the war, they did it with devastating effectiveness. On January 11, 1942, submarine I-6 torpedoed and damaged the aircraft carrier Saratoga off Hawaii, putting her out of action for 5 months. On September 15th, I-19 sank Wasp and damaged the battleship North Carolina in a single attack. On June 6th, I-168 finished off the already damaged carrier Yorktown after the Battle of Midway, delivering the final blow to what had been one of America's most successful carriers. These were not minor achievements. In 1942 alone, Japanese submarines sank 2 fleet carriers and damaged 2 battleships. They attacked cruisers. They harassed destroyer screens. They operated in waters the Americans thought secure. For submarine crews like Tanabe's, these successes confirmed everything their doctrine had promised. They were doing their job. They were sinking major warships. They were, they believed, contributing meaningfully to Japan's war effort. But there was something else happening in the Pacific that same year, something that received far less attention in Japanese naval circles, something that would prove far more important than any number of carrier sinkings. While Japanese submarines hunted American carriers in the waters around Guadalcanal, something extraordinary was taking place in shipyards scattered across the United States. At the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, at Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, and at the Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin, workers were building submarines at a pace that would have seemed impossible just months before. The submarines they were building were not experimental designs or prototype vessels. They were production models, specifically the Gato class, which would become the workhorse of the American submarine campaign in the Pacific. The first Gato, USS Gato herself, had been commissioned in December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. By mid-1942, the production lines were running at full capacity. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard had developed a revolutionary approach to submarine construction. Instead of building boats on traditional ways where each component was added sequentially, they fabricated large sections in shops, then moved these sections to the building ways for assembly. There were 20 sections for each submarine, the heaviest weighing up to 50 tons. Massive overhead cranes lifted complete hull sections and lowered them into place, where welders joined them together. This modular construction method, adapted from automotive manufacturing techniques, reduced construction time dramatically. In 1940, it had taken 18 to 24 months to build a submarine from keel laying to commission. By mid-1943, using these new methods, Portsmouth was completing submarines in 9 months, sometimes less. The yard had 6 new building ways added specifically for submarine construction, supplemented by vast workshops where sections were fabricated simultaneously. When one submarine moved down the building way, another was already being assembled from sections that had been constructed weeks earlier. The workforce that made this possible was unlike anything the Navy had seen before. It included experienced shipwrights and welders who had built vessels for decades, but it also included thousands of women, many of whom had never worked in heavy industry before the war. They welded armor plate, they assembled complex machinery, they installed electrical systems and hydraulic lines. They worked 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Portsmouth yard alone employed over 20,000 workers at its wartime peak. By late 1942, the Navy Department, recognizing both the capability of these yards and the strategic importance of submarines in the Pacific, began placing massive orders. In mid-1942, orders went out for 112 more submarines beyond those already under construction. Electric Boat received 46, Portsmouth received 30, Manitowoc received 20. By early 1943, Portsmouth's building rate had climbed to approximately 16 submarines per year and was still increasing. The submarines coming off these building ways were formidable vessels. The Gato-class boats displaced 1,526 tons surfaced, 2,410 tons submerged. They measured 312 feet long with a beam of 27 feet. 4 Fairbanks Morse or General Motors diesel engines provided 5,400 horsepower on the surface. 4 electric motors drove the twin propellers when submerged. Surface speed was 21 knots. Submerged speed was 9 knots, sustainable for hours thanks to massive battery banks. Range was 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots on the surface. This was critical for Pacific operations. A Gato-class submarine could depart Pearl Harbor, patrol for weeks in Japanese waters, and return to Hawaii without refueling. The boats carried 24 torpedoes, 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, allowing devastating initial salvos followed by reloads. Crew complement was 60 officers and men, enough to operate the boat continuously on long patrols while maintaining watches and conducting maintenance. By mid-1943, an improved version, the Balao class, was entering production. Externally almost identical to the Gato, the Balao incorporated a stronger pressure hull made from improved steel, allowing deeper diving depth. Where Gatos were tested to 300 feet, Balaos were tested to 400 feet. This seemingly modest improvement provided crucial tactical advantages, allowing American submarines to dive deeper when evading Japanese depth charges. Production of Balao-class submarines began at Portsmouth in January 1943 with USS Perch. Electric boats follow on yard. Manitowoc laid the keel of their first Balao in July 1943. By the end of that year, multiple yards were producing both Gato and Balao-class boats simultaneously, with new submarines being commissioned at a rate of several per month. 120 Balao-class submarines would ultimately be completed. The numbers were staggering by any standard. 77 Gato-class submarines were commissioned between 1941 and 1944. 120 Balao-class submarines were commissioned between 1943 and 1948, with most completed during the war years. 29 Tench-class submarines, a further improved version of the Balao, were commissioned before the war ended. The total approached 230 fleet submarines completed in just over 3 years. Japan, by comparison, completed 63 large submarines before the war began, and added perhaps another 70 during the war years. The construction time for Japanese submarines averaged 18 to 24 months throughout the war, never approaching the efficiency American yards achieved. Japan simply lacked the industrial infrastructure, the raw materials, and the specialized workforce necessary for mass production on the American scale. But the disparity in numbers, dramatic as it was, only tells part of the story. What mattered more than how many submarines each nation built was what those submarines were ordered to do once they reached the combat zone. And here, the difference between Japanese and American doctrine would prove decisive in ways neither side fully understood in those early months of the war. What the Imperial Japanese Navy understood about submarine warfare was not wrong, exactly. It was incomplete. The doctrine of interceptive operations made sense in the abstract. If Japanese submarines could sink enough American carriers and battleships before the decisive fleet engagement, the numerical disadvantage imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty might be overcome. The mathematics seemed sound. Each carrier sunk was one less flight deck launching strikes against Japanese forces. Each battleship sent to the bottom was one less gun line providing fire support for amphibious operations. The problem was that this doctrine assumed a particular kind of war. It assumed a war that would be decided by a single climactic naval battle, similar to Tsushima in 1905, when the Japanese fleet had destroyed the Russian Baltic fleet in one afternoon of intense combat. It assumed American industrial capacity could not replace losses faster than Japanese submarines could inflict them, and it assumed that warships, rather than merchant vessels, were the critical targets that would determine the war's outcome. These assumptions were already obsolete by December 1941. Though few on either side fully recognized it yet, the war that was actually going to be fought would not be decided by a single fleet engagement. It would be a war of attrition, of industrial production, of logistics spanning thousands of miles of ocean. In this kind of war, the ships that mattered most were not the glamorous carriers and battleships. They were the unglamorous cargo vessels, tankers, and transports that kept armies supplied and industries functioning. Japan's economy depended absolutely on maritime commerce. The home islands lacked the natural resources to sustain a modern industrial war machine. Oil came from the Dutch East Indies and Borneo. Iron ore came from Malaya and the Philippines. Rice came from Indochina and Thailand. Coal came from Manchuria and Korea. Every factory, every power plant, every military base depended on a constant flow of raw materials arriving by ship. In December 1941, Japan's merchant marine totaled approximately 6.4 million gross tons. This fleet consisted of everything from modern diesel-powered cargo ships to elderly coal-burning freighters. from specialized tankers to combination passenger cargo vessels. The Japanese shipping industry had calculated that maintaining the war economy required approximately 3 million tons of merchant shipping in constant operation, shuttling between the home islands and the newly conquered territories of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This calculation was based on peacetime assumptions. It assumed ships could operate on regular schedules without significant losses. It assumed cargo capacity would remain constant. It assumed the sea lanes between Japan and the resource areas would remain essentially secure, with losses to enemy action being minimal and manageable. These assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. American submarines received very different orders than their Japanese counterparts. On December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz issued the following directive to the Pacific Submarine Force: execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. This was not a temporary emergency measure. It was a strategic decision that would govern American submarine operations for the entire war. Unrestricted submarine warfare meant American submarines would attack any Japanese vessel encountered, military or civilian, without warning. Merchant ships would be legitimate targets. Fishing boats would be legitimate targets. Coastal transports would be legitimate targets. The goal was not to sink enemy warships, though submarines would certainly attack them when opportunities arose. The goal was to destroy Japan's merchant marine, to sever the maritime connections between the home islands and the resource areas, to strangle the Japanese war economy by cutting off the flow of raw materials it needed to function. This doctrine had historical precedent. German U-boats in the First World War had nearly brought Britain to her knees through unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant shipping. In 1917, British food reserves had fallen to just 6 weeks' supply before the convoy system, and improved anti-submarine measures turned the tide. American naval planners understood this history. They understood that island nations, dependent on maritime trade, were vulnerable to campaigns against their merchant fleets. But understanding a concept intellectually and implementing it successfully in practice are different matters. In the first 18 months of the war, American submarines struggled with problems that severely limited their effectiveness. The Mark 14 torpedo, which had never been properly tested in peacetime due to cost concerns, was plagued by multiple defects. The magnetic exploder frequently detonated prematurely or failed to detonate at all. The contact exploder often failed when torpedoes struck targets at the perpendicular angle recommended in training. Torpedoes ran deeper than their depth settings indicated, passing harmlessly beneath targets. American submarine commanders in 1942 and early 1943 reported attack after attack where torpedoes either failed to explode or exploded without sinking the target. The frustration was immense. Boats would expend their entire torpedo load in carefully executed attacks, only to watch targets sail away undamaged. It took until September 1943 for the Bureau of Ordnance to finally acknowledge all the defects and implement corrections. Only then could American submarines begin to demonstrate their true potential. Japanese submarines, by contrast, had excellent torpedoes. The Type 95 was reliable, powerful, and accurate. The oxygen-fueled propulsion system left minimal wake, making torpedoes difficult to spot and evade. When Japanese submarines attacked warships, their weapons generally performed as designed. This technical superiority reinforced Japanese confidence in their doctrine. Their submarines were sinking carriers. American submarines seemed to be accomplishing relatively little. The early war seemed to validate every assumption Japanese naval planners had made. The turning point did not come in a single dramatic moment. It came gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, as American submarines solved their torpedo problems and began operating in large numbers across the Pacific. By mid-1943, the pattern of war at sea was changing in ways that would have profound implications for both submarine forces. In June 1943, American submarines sank 34 Japanese merchant ships totaling 147,000 tons. In July, they sank 33 ships totaling 158,000 tons. These were not warships. These were cargo vessels, tankers, and transports. They were the unglamorous targets that Japanese submarine doctrine largely ignored. The vessels carrying oil from Sumatra, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, and bauxite from the East Indies. Each sinking represented not just the loss of the ship itself, but the loss of its cargo and the disruption of the supply chain it served. A tanker sunk in the South China Sea meant less oil reaching Japanese refineries. A cargo vessel sunk off the Philippines meant fewer industrial materials reaching Japanese factories. The losses were cumulative, compounding over time as the merchant fleet shrank and the distances that surviving ships had to cover increased. By the end of 1943, American submarines had sunk approximately 300 Japanese merchant ships totaling over 1.3 million gross tons. Japan had started the year with roughly 6 million tons of merchant shipping. New construction during 1943 added approximately 770,000 tons. Simple arithmetic revealed the problem. Japan had lost more tonnage to American submarines than its shipyards could replace. The merchant fleet was shrinking, and it was shrinking at an accelerating rate. Japanese naval staff, officers began to recognize the crisis by early 1944. Internal documents from the Navy General Staff show growing concern about merchant shipping, losses and their impact on the war economy. But the solution, they believed, was better convoy protection and more aggressive anti-submarine warfare, not a fundamental rethinking of their own submarine doctrine. Japanese submarines continued to receive orders to attack enemy warships, to patrol off American bases waiting for carriers and battleships, to support fleet operations rather than conducting independent campaigns against merchant shipping. The results of this doctrine were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Through all of 1944, Japanese submarines sank only 19 Allied merchant ships. 19. In the same period, American submarines sank over 600 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling approximately 2.4 million gross tons. The disparity was not 10 to 1 or 20 to 1. It was more than 30 to 1. Consider what these numbers meant in practical terms. Every tanker sunk meant less fuel oil for the combined fleet, less aviation gasoline for the air forces, less diesel for merchant ships and locomotives. By mid-1944, fuel shortages were forcing the combined fleet to base major units in Singapore and Linggar roads near Sumatra, closer to the oil sources because there was insufficient fuel to bring the oil to Japan and then send the fleet back out. The great carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor was largely grounded because there was no aviation fuel for pilot training. Every cargo vessel sunk meant fewer raw materials reaching Japanese factories. Steel production began falling in 1944, not because the mills were damaged, but because iron ore shipments from the Asian mainland were being intercepted. Aluminum production fell because bauxite from the Dutch East Indies was not arriving. Food shortages began affecting civilian populations in Japan because rice imports from the empire were being cut off. The home islands were slowly being isolated from the resources that sustained them. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, commanding the submarine I-58, later described the frustration of Japanese submarine operations in 1944 and 1945. His orders consistently directed him to patrol specific areas, waiting for American carrier task forces. He would spend weeks on station, seeing nothing but empty ocean, while all around him, American submarines were destroying the merchant fleet. In his post-war memoir, he wrote that by 1945, we seemed to be spending all our time dodging American aircraft and destroyers while accomplishing nothing of value. I-58 would achieve brief fame in July 1945 when she torpedoed and sank the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis after the cruiser delivered components of the atomic bomb to Tinian. This was exactly the kind of success Japanese submarine doctrine had been designed to achieve, sinking a major warship. But by that date, Japan's merchant marine had been virtually destroyed. The Indianapolis sinking, dramatic as it was, had no impact on the war's outcome. The strategic situation had already been decided by thousands of merchant ship sinkings that received no publicity and no celebration. The Japanese submarine force itself was being steadily destroyed. American anti-submarine capabilities improved dramatically as the war progressed. Better radar allowed aircraft to detect surface submarines at night. Improved sonar allowed destroyers and destroyer escorts to track submerged boats. More depth charges and improved tactics made successful attacks more likely. By 1945, the survival rate for Japanese submarines on patrol had fallen to catastrophic levels. Approximately 130 Japanese submarines were lost during the war. Most were sunk while achieving nothing of strategic value. By the spring of 1945, the maritime strangulation of Japan was complete. American submarines had accomplished what no bombing campaign or naval blockade or amphibious assault could achieve alone. They had severed the connections between Japan and the resources necessary to sustain industrial warfare, The numbers compiled after the war by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee told a story of systematic destruction that changed how naval warfare would be understood. American submarines sank 1,214 Japanese merchant ships during the war, totaling approximately 4.7 million gross tons. This represented roughly 60% of all Japanese merchant losses. The remaining 40% came from air attacks, mines, surface ship actions, and other causes. But submarines were the primary instrument of Japan's maritime destruction, and they had accomplished this with fewer than 200 boats operating simultaneously at any given time. The impact on specific cargo categories was even more dramatic than the overall tonnage figures suggested. American submarines sank 124 tankers during the war. These were not randomly distributed losses. Submarine commanders specifically targeted tankers whenever possible, understanding that oil was the most critical commodity flowing from the southern resource areas to Japan. By mid-1945, oil imports to Japan had fallen to less than 10% of early war levels. The Imperial Navy's fuel reserves, which had totaled nearly 8 million barrels in mid-1944, had fallen to less than 400,000 barrels by August 1945. This collapse of the tanker fleet had cascading effects throughout the Japanese war machine. The combined fleet, which in 1942 had ranged across the entire Pacific, was by 1945 largely immobile. The super battleship Yamato's final sortie to Okinawa in April 1945 was a one-way mission, not primarily because of the tactical situation, but because there was insufficient fuel for a return voyage. Japanese aircraft were increasingly grounded because aviation fuel could not reach air bases in adequate quantities. Training flights were curtailed, leaving new pilots with minimal experience before being sent into combat. The destruction of cargo vessels carrying food had equally severe consequences. Japan's civilian food supply had always depended partly on imports from Korea, Formosa, and Indochina. By 1945, these imports had been reduced to a trickle. Rice rations in Japanese cities fell to levels barely adequate for survival. Malnutrition became widespread. Industrial workers, weakened by inadequate food, could not maintain previous production levels. The entire home front economy began deteriorating, not because of bombing damage, though that was severe, but because the maritime supply system had been destroyed. The comparison with Japanese submarine accomplishments is stark and merciless. Japanese submarines sank approximately 184 Allied merchant ships during the entire war, totaling roughly 900,000 gross tons. Against the United States specifically, Japanese submarines sank about 50 merchant vessels. These losses were not strategically significant. American merchant ship construction during the war totaled roughly 33 million gross tons. Japanese submarines were sinking ships at less than 5% of the rate American shipyards were building them. Japanese submarines did sink several major warships, achievements that received considerable publicity and recognition. The carriers, Yorktown and Wasp, sunk in 1942. The escort carrier, Liscombe Bay, sunk in November 1943 with heavy loss of life. The cruiser Indianapolis sunk in July 1945. Approximately 30% of Japanese submarine attacks during the war were directed against warships, and they did inflict meaningful losses on the Allied naval forces, particularly in the difficult year of 1942. But what did these sinkings actually achieve in strategic terms? The answer, painful as it was for Japanese submarine crews to contemplate, was very little. The United States commissioned 8 Essex-class fleet carriers between 1942 and 1945, along with numerous escort carriers. The 2 carriers sunk by Japanese submarines in 1942 were replaced many times over. American shipyards launched over 100 escort carriers during the war. Small aircraft carriers built on merchant hulls that could be constructed in less than a year. The mathematical reality was crushing. Japanese submarines, following their doctrine of attacking high-value warships, achieved tactical successes that had no strategic impact. American submarines, systematically destroying merchant shipping, achieved tactical successes that accumulated into strategic victory. Every Japanese tanker sunk meant less fuel for the entire war machine. Every Japanese cargo vessel sunk meant fewer materials for factories. The cumulative effect of hundreds of merchant ship sinkings was the slow starvation of Japan's industrial economy. Commander Hashimoto, after the war, reflected on this disparity in his memoir. He wrote that Japanese submarine crews knew American submarines were sinking merchant ships in large numbers, but they had been taught that such targets were not worth the attention of fleet submarines. We were told that merchant ships were for lesser vessels, for coast defense boats and converted destroyers, he wrote. Fleet submarines were meant for fleet actions against fleet units. Only late in the war did we begin to understand that we had been fighting the wrong war entirely. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, its merchant marine had been reduced to approximately 1.5 million gross tons of serviceable shipping. This was less than 25% of what the nation had possessed in December 1941. Most surviving ships were damaged, poorly maintained, and operating at reduced efficiency due to lack of spare parts and qualified crews. The maritime supply system that had sustained Japan's war economy had been essentially destroyed, not by dramatic fleet battles or massive amphibious assaults, but by patient, systematic submarine warfare against unglamorous cargo vessels. The strategic lesson was clear, though it had been learned at terrible cost. In industrial warfare between modern nations separated by vast ocean distances, merchant shipping is the critical vulnerability. The side that can protect its merchant fleet while destroying the enemy's will, have access to resources while denying them to the opponent. Naval theorists had written about this principle for decades. American submariners in the Pacific proved it worked. For the men who served in Japanese submarines during the war, the realization of what they had failed to accomplish came in stages, each more bitter than the last. Some understood early, watching American merchant ships pass unmolested while they waited for carriers that never came. Others held to their training and doctrine until the very end, believing that sinking warships was the highest form of submarine warfare. But all of them eventually had to confront the mathematics of strategic failure. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Orita, who commanded several submarines during the war, later described the moment when the truth became undeniable. It came in early 1945 when he was briefed on the overall shipping situation before departing on patrol. The staff officer giving the briefing showed charts depicting monthly merchant ship losses, monthly imports of critical materials, and projected industrial production levels based on available resources. The lines on every chart were falling, some precipitously. We had known for months that the war was going badly, Orita wrote in his memoir published decades later. We had known that American submarines were sinking many ships, but to see the totals, to understand that our merchant marine had essentially ceased to exist, to recognize that we had contributed almost nothing to preventing this disaster, that was the moment I understood we had been fighting the wrong war from the beginning. The psychological impact on submarine crews was profound and complex. These were not men who had shirked their duty or performed poorly. They had followed their orders, executed their training, and achieved the objectives they had been given. When they were told to attack warships, they attacked warships. When they were told to patrol specific areas waiting for enemy carriers, they patrolled those areas. They had done everything their doctrine demanded, and still they had lost. Completely and catastrophically, Commander Hashimoto, whose I-58 sank the Indianapolis, lived until the year 2000. In his later years, he spoke frequently about the war and Japan's submarine doctrine. He described meeting American submarine veterans after the war and learning about their operations. They told me about hunting in wolf packs along the convoy routes, he recalled in an interview conducted in the 1980s. They described tracking merchant ships for days, coordinating attacks with other submarines, systematically destroying cargo after cargo. We never did anything like that. We would not have been permitted to do anything like that. The Japanese submarine service lost approximately 130 boats during the war, and roughly 10,000 officers and men killed. This casualty rate of nearly 60% was among the highest of any military service in any nation during the war. These men died following orders that sent them to hunt targets that did not matter while ignoring targets that did. They died bravely, competently, professionally. They died in a service that achieved tactical successes while contributing to strategic defeat. Some submarines survived the war only to be scuttled by their own crews after the surrender. I-400, the massive submarine aircraft carrier that represented the pinnacle of Japanese submarine design, surrendered to American forces in August 1945 and was later sunk as a target to prevent the technology from falling into Soviet hands. I-401, her sister ship, met the same fate. These enormous boats, which could have carried cargo to isolated garrisons or evacuated critical personnel, had instead been designed to launch aircraft attacks against the Panama Canal, an operation that was planned but never executed. The few Japanese submarines that survived to be studied by American naval architects after the war were impressive in many respects. Their underwater speed was excellent. Their range was extraordinary. Their habitability was reasonable given the constraints of submarine design. But examining them, American engineers recognized that these boats had been designed for a specific mission that had proven strategically irrelevant. They were scout cruisers and fleet support submarines in a war that required cargo interdiction and merchant ship destruction. Captain Edward Beach, who served on American submarines during the war and later became a prominent naval historian, wrote extensively about Japanese submarine doctrine and its failures. The Japanese submarine force was technically competent, professionally trained, and adequately equipped, he wrote in his comprehensive study of submarine warfare. What it lacked was a coherent strategic doctrine that matched the actual requirements of the war Japan was fighting. This was not a failure of the submarine crews. It was a failure of the naval establishment that gave them their orders. The tragedy, Beach argued, was not that Japanese submarines failed to sink enough American ships. The tragedy was that they were never given the opportunity to fight the war that might have made a difference. Had Japanese submarines been ordered to attack merchant shipping systematically from the war's beginning, had they been positioned along the sea lanes between Australia and Hawaii, between the west coast and the forward bases, between Pearl Harbor and the combat zones, they might have achieved results that genuinely complicated Allied operations. The American submariners who fought the campaign against Japanese merchant shipping faced their own psychological challenges, though of a different kind. They had been ordered to wage unrestricted submarine warfare against a nation's entire maritime commerce. This meant sinking not just military transports, but civilian cargo ships. Not just modern freighters, but elderly coastal vessels. Not just purpose-built warships, but converted passenger liners carrying troops. The men who pulled the triggers on torpedo launches, who watched through periscopes as merchant ships broke apart and sank, who heard the underwater sounds of bulkheads collapsing and boilers exploding, were engaging in what was essentially economic warfare against an entire population. They were not fighting soldiers who had chosen military service. They were killing merchant sailors whose crime was sailing under the wrong flag in waters claimed by the wrong power. Commander Richard O'Kane, who commanded USS Tang through 5 war patrols that sank 33 ships totaling over 100,000 tons, described the moral complexity of this mission in his post-war writings. Every patrol involved sinking ships we knew carried not just military cargo, but civilian goods. Not just soldiers, but merchant crews who were essentially non-combatants, he wrote. We did it because we had been ordered to do it, because we understood it was necessary to win the war, because we believed the alternative, a Japanese victory, was unconscionable. But that did not make it easy. Tang's 5th patrol ended in tragedy when one of her own torpedoes malfunctioned, circled back, and struck the submarine. Tang sank in 180 feet of water off the coast of China in October 1944. Only 9 men survived, including O'Kane, who spent the rest of the war in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his submarine commands, and later became one of the most respected voices in analyzing submarine warfare. American submarine crews faced extreme dangers throughout the war. 52 American submarines were lost in combat, with 3,732 officers and men killed. This represented a casualty rate of approximately 22%, one of the highest loss rates in the United States military. These men fought in vessels that offered no possibility of survival if the boat was sunk in deep water. They hunted in enemy-controlled waters, often operating alone, relying on stealth and their own skills to evade detection and destruction.